If you're a parent of a teen, you probably know this feeling. One day, you have this sweet, talkative little child who thinks you are the best thing on the planet, and then overnight they turn into this eye-rolling, door-slamming mystery. It's like you're living with an entirely different person. Or perhaps it feels like your teenager went from being a lovable angel who couldn't get enough of you to someone who barely speaks and cringes every time you open your mouth. What if I were to tell you this is probably normal, but there's also some nifty pointers that might help you out when it comes to parent-teen relationships and how to talk to teenagers? My name is Oliver, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in Los Angeles, and I've spent close to a decade working with teenagers, parents, and families, and trying to help people grow great relationships. I started my career as a school-based counselor and then worked in adolescent residential treatment centers, and finally became the clinical director of a treatment center in Malibu and created a program that specialized in helping families with teens. So I've got some things to say about the subject. I'm here with some insider knowledge that I've picked up over the years that I hope will give you some top tips on parent-teen relationships, how to communicate, and really to understand what's going on with them. All of these pointers are kind of common sense, but at the same time, it also feels like you've got to learn a new language, so it can be very confusing parenting a teen. But to be fair, I think it's even more confusing for an adolescent who's in such an awkward position of desperately wanting to be an adult, while really also not quite wanting to let go of being a child. So here are my top 10 tips for parent-teen relationship communication, and there's a nifty handout coming very soon on oliverdrakefordtherapy.com, and as soon as it's ready, I will put the link to that in the notes below. Tip number 1. Less is more. Let's be real, teenagers have a built-in radar for detecting when a conversation is about to turn into a lecture. The moment they sense it, they are out. So you might be wondering, why is that? Well, it could be because they're juggling a million different things: school, friends, activities, and let's be honest, probably a whole bunch of TikTok. So when you finally get them to engage, they are expecting you to hit them full force with all the reminders, the to-do list, the consequences, the lectures, and anything that you've been storing up since you last managed to get them to look in your direction. So I want you to remember that less is more. Instead of diving into all of the things, focus on what really matters and try and keep it brief. Imagine your teen actually has the capacity to really only hear one or two things that you say in the best case. So in a long drawn out conversation from a parent, that goes down to 0. Being concise is super important. It's kind of respectful of their time and space, but it's also really about keeping them engaged and getting your point across. So in my sessions with teenagers, I try really hard to be attuned to this, and I'm actually okay ending the session a little earlier than I would do with an adult, because I'm fully aware that teenagers can only really handle so much of their weird English therapy after a full day of school and sports practice and then have to go home and do homework. Tip number 2, catch them in the right moment. You might have noticed already that sometimes the best conversations happen with your teen when you're not trying too hard. With some teens, a forced heart-to-heart moment is never going to work. I suggest, if this is how it feels with you and your teen, to wait for the moments when they're naturally more open, like during a relaxed dinner or a car ride, or while doing a shared activity or going shopping. These low-pressure situations allow discussions to happen organically without feeling forced or pressured. So when they do start talking, just go with the flow. I think by taking advantage of these moments rather than forcing a moment, you show that you're available without pushing them away with a long to-do list. My top therapist tip here is just to be curious, like overly curious. Teens will never admit this to you, but they are craving contact with an adult, and they are desperate for you to be interested in whatever it is that they're bringing up. For example, for someone who has never played Minecraft, I can tell you so much about that game, the different strategies, even how to build a game on a server. And that's because I've spent a whole bunch of therapy sessions being curious and asking questions about all things Minecraft to certain teenagers who started to tell me it's what they like. This leads me nicely onto the next tip, which is to ditch the life lessons. This has got to be one of the most subtly challenging parts of parenting a teenager. One moment you have these helpless babies who are so curious about everything and how things work, and the next you have a tween who just doesn't want to hear another lesson from you. So it's a really hard habit to break, because objectively you do know more than them, usually, and part of your job description as a parent is to help teach them and educate them and guide them. But here's the thing. Teens don't always want a solution, and they definitely don't want an unprompted life lesson or teaching moment from you. More often than not, they just want to be heard. So if every conversation with you turns into a life lesson, preaching, or a monologue, you'll quickly find that they will stop coming to you altogether. So instead, I suggest you try and be their sounding board. Reflective listening is your best friend here. You just acknowledge their feelings without offering up advice like you're Oprah or you're on a TED Talk. In the past, your old job was absolutely about teaching, but with your teens, your new job description is more about creating a safe space where they know they can vent, they can explore their thoughts and curiosities and not be met with a lecture. They're going to feel more validated and understood. The more they feel validated and understood, the more likely they'll come back because they know you're going to listen and not fix. And to clarify that even more, I've turned it into the next top tip. Zip it. Just zip it. I hear it from parents all the time. My teen just doesn't talk to me anymore, or I have no clue what's going on in their inner world. And here's the thing, sometimes teens don't open up because they feel like the moment they do, they'll get hit with advice, opinions, a lecture. But the secret for talking to teens is that the more space you give them just to share, the more likely they'll be to keep talking. And that is really what, as a parent, you want. You just want them to talk at you. So think of it as a 90-10 rule, perhaps an 80-20 rule. Listen 90% of the time and just talk 10%. Teens' brains are wired temporarily so that they feel most heard when they're leading the conversation and they get the most words in. You're going to find that they share more when they can talk. You might be amazed at how much more they share when they know they're not going to get interrupted and they've had that experience with you of not being interrupted. This 90-10 rule becomes especially important when we start talking about friends. Now, I get it. Sometimes you're not exactly thrilled with who your teenager is hanging out with, but criticizing their friends can really make them shut down fast. Now, if someone your teen is hanging out with is inappropriate or dangerous, this obviously doesn't apply. If they're hanging out with someone who is leading them to participate in risky behaviors or into drugs and alcohol, you should absolutely intervene. I'm talking more about friends that they're just talking about, people that they're in class with, who you may or may not know personally, but what you do hear about them is getting your mama or papa bear all riled up. So I do have to give you a brief lecture now on developmental psychology, and I promise I will be brief. At this age, teens are struggling to become their own person, and the only way that they can do that is to push you and their family away a certain amount and to find out who they are in relationship to their peers. They are trying to balance feeling connected to you, who they still love, but are also struggling with the desire to become an adult who is an individual with a separate identity from their family. We call a teen's friendship group their second family because it's that important to them and it is developmentally appropriate. As a result, teens are incredibly protective of their social circles, and I would caution you to not jump in with judgments on any friends and just stay curious. Asking questions like, what do you like about hanging out with them? Or how do they make you feel? Those sort of questions help you take a step back and you're more likely to keep the conversation flowing and learn more about what's really going on rather than passing judgments or your thoughts or beliefs on the matter. Judgments will shut it down. So on the topic of friends, the next tip is about social image. Because now you know how and why friends are so important to your teens, you might get even more how social rejection or even feeling out of sync with a friend group as a teenager is excruciatingly painful. Literally, I've had teen clients beg to change schools because they've fallen out with their friends. So if you are too involved or too present when they hang out with their friends, like constantly asking for updates or trying to be the cool mum or dad in their social group, then it can feel really infantilizing and embarrassing, and that is very, very painful for a teenager. The more you push in, the more they will retreat. And to make this even more complicated for you, the way your teen perceives you when their friends are around is likely to be hugely distorted and out of context. So a cough at the wrong time might get you an evil glare from a teenager. Now, I'm definitely not advocating for you to disappear from all social situations. You're still the boss and you need to be there. I'm just saying that it's helpful to be sensitive to your child, or at least understand how agonizing social situations and how embarrassing parents are to a teenager. So if you can step back and give them room to handle things on their own while still being there subtly, you are winning. When you do this, you're signaling that you trust them, which is exactly what they want, and then they will keep on coming back to you for more support when things do get rough. The next tip is give them space. You might be picking up the idea that independence is the currency of the teen years. And one of the best ways to strengthen your relationship with your teen or tween is to respect their need for privacy. Privacy? Privacy. Privacy. I'd also add that this is a privilege that gets earned over time. So one of the things I talk about in my parenting course is age-appropriate autonomy. Ideally, we're giving children and teens more and more freedom and empowerment as they get older. So that some of that is physical autonomy, so maybe staying out longer, walking home by yourself, but also psychological autonomy, which means more emotional space and privacy. Constantly prying or pushing for details makes teenagers feel like they are under surveillance, and that's a surefire way to get them to clamp up. So ironically, giving them space and letting them decide when to share builds the very trust that you're hoping for. When they know and when they have had an experience of you not always digging for information, they're going to be more likely to open up on their own terms. And the goal here is allow them the room to navigate their world while knowing that you are there to help when needed. So this is not just a nice thing to do. This is not an optional thing. Psychological autonomy is actually a requirement for their well-being and transition into being happy, healthy, well-adjusted young adults. Number 8, support without getting swept up. So as you're giving them more privacy and more space to develop that independence and that psychological autonomy, remember that the way you handle their emotions plays a really big part in this. Teens are a whirlwind of emotions and hormones, one day riding high and the next they are in the depths of despair because one direction broke up. Wow, I'm really dating myself with that one, huh? As a parent, though, it's really easy to get swept up in those ups and downs. But that can be experienced by your teenager as a lack of space, which goes against giving them that psychological autonomy. What they really need from you is consistency, and granted, that's not easy. But if you are able to stay steady and grounded, you become their lighthouse in the storm of their emotions. If you're too emotionally reactive or overly involved, it can make them feel smothered and even escalate the drama. So instead, aim to be the calm, reassuring presence that they can lean on. Offer guidance if they ask for it without getting caught up in the emotional storms. That helps them feel secure and stable. Build trust, not walls. Trust is the glue that holds all of this together. Giving space, staying steady when they're emotional, and offering support when they ask without jumping in to fix everything is what builds trust. And as your teenager starts to experience you respecting their privacy and holding back from prying or overreacting, they'll feel safer opening up and trust you more. But here's the catch. Trust can be broken if they feel like what they share will be thrown back in their face or used against them later. I think it's the same for adults, right? But teens are particularly sensitive to this. So if they confide in you about something, don't use that information against them in future disagreements or as a gotcha or to teach them a lesson. When they see that you keep their confidence sacred, they start to view you as someone who respects their autonomy and independence. And that's when the walls come down, leading to more conversations and more honest discussions. So if I'm working with a teenager and there's something going on that I really have to tell their parents about, I have a deal that I make with my teens upfront, which is me and the teen will discuss it first before I call a parent. Parent might have to hear something about what the teen said, but the deal that I make is that my teenage clients are never going to be caught off guard. They're never going to be blindsided by me calling a parent behind their back. And that is the best way that I can handle trust. And the final point here is what to do when a teen is upset. So this sort of summarizes everything we've spoken about, but is particularly helpful when it comes to a situation we've not covered, and that is what to do when a teen is visibly upset. It's really natural as a parent to feel a rush of anxiety that makes you want to jump in and fix things or offer advice or at least give them a hug. One of my favorite things to say is whenever we act out of that anxious urge to do something, it's rarely ever the best option. In fact, it often makes things worse. If you're pushing for a solution when they're not ready to hear a solution, or you're smothering them with a hug when they don't actually want to be comforted. So instead, what I suggest you do is to take a step back and ask what they need in that moment. Are you interested in my ideas on what to do? Do you want me to just listen? Or do you need a hug? In which case, you just sit with them quietly. So this approach is about asking what you want rather than assuming. Just because you like a hug when you are sad does not mean that other people like a hug when they are sad. So again, this is about autonomy. It's about giving your teen choices here. It's about offering support without overwhelming them. And teens are at a stage where they're learning how to manage their own emotions. So you really do need to pull back when they are upset and let them figure out how to regulate their own emotions by asking what they need. So the next time you have that urge to rush in and fix something, here's what you're going to say. How can I help you right now? Do you want to be helped? Do you want to be heard? Or do you want to be hugged? Sometimes the most loving thing that you can do is just ask. All right, I hope these 10 tips were super helpful for you. Remember, you can get a PDF download to all of this on my website, oliverdrakefordtherapy.com. And once again, I work with teenagers, parents, and families. My office is right in the middle of West Hollywood, Los Angeles.